Welcome to everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Falak Tijani, and I'm a Senior Manager at Sahel Consulting. And it is an absolute honor to serve as the moderator for this section themed the impact of big data on the African food ecosystem. Over the next 50 minutes, this panel will discuss on how we and why we as Africans need to generate our own data, as well as provide practical examples of how we can maximize the use of and benefits of data in agriculture. Introducing the panelists for the who will lean into the conversation and share insights on the topic. In no particular order, we have Dr. Jessica Fanzo. She is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Ethics. She's Director, Global Food Ethics and Policy Program at the Johns Hopkins University. We have Dr. Simon Winter. He is the Executive Director of the Syngenta Foundation, with an overarching goal to achieve food security for all, sustainability, and agricultural transformation. Sorry, Profiling and Messages Service Organization. Thank you all for honoring presence today. As we are diving into the conversation, please send us your questions and comments using the chat box to the left of your screen, and we will get to as many of your questions as possible. Now, to our panelists. By 2050, it is projected that Africa will nearly double in size. However, food insecurity and malnutrition remain a big challenge. And this is a question for all the panelists. I'll start with Jessica. Given the overwhelming importance of data in modern day planning and decision making, how can data be used in the agriculture and nutrition sector to promote sustainable growth and zero hunger?
Well, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this panel. It's really nice to be here to talk about data. I think we're at an interesting time in that the importance of data has never been more important, because a lot of data and evidence is under great scrutiny. We're in this time of misinformation. Sometimes data is openly disregarded by policymakers. So I think we need to, as those who collect data and those who share data, we need to keep up those standards, ensure the rigors of science and evidence are maintained, because data and research is really important in setting a positive direction towards global food security, nutrition, and health. And it can really bring wholesale changes to political thought and action. So I would argue, how can data be used in agriculture nutrition sector? We actually need to use data. You know, what you don't measure cannot be governed, or what you don't measure can't be managed. So we all need to start thinking about how we use data and use it effectively in decision making. When we think about things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which is really focusing on ending hunger and malnutrition, it's really important for us for countries, particularly those in Africa, to be thinking about realistic targets and how far they can go to achieving zero hunger, and sticking to those targets, measuring them annually, and holding governments to account to try to track those targets effectively. I used to be the co-chair of the Global Nutrition Report. And when we looked at countries to see what kind of indicators they track towards zero hunger and improved nutrition and sustainable food systems, many countries just don't track data. They don't track it regularly, track it openly. So we really need to push our governments to track that data on an annual basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Great points you've made. Many countries just don't track the data. Would you agree with that, Dr. Simon?
So I'm coming at this question from the, let's say, the micro end of the spectrum rather than perhaps the macro end of the spectrum. Our foundation is very focused on helping smallholders who are still remain mired in poverty and not having successful livelihoods from their agricultural engagements and work to become a lot more successful. So for us, the first point is, what data do the farmers need? And what information do they need in order to be able to change their practices, to be able to access finance, to be able to access markets, et cetera, et cetera. And then, who are the organizations that are going to then engage with the farmers, and what information do they need? Innovators who are trying to develop new technologies that could help with agricultural transformation, input and service providers who want to be part of the journey to help those smallholders advance, off-takers who maybe now see them as a sourcing potential. And then eventually, of course, we get back to the policymakers who are going to create the stronger enabling environment for all of this to be able to be done more easily. So it's very important to understand a very holistic picture for us about then what data is needed for the farmers by the farmers first, but then how does that data flow in and out of all of those other stakeholders? And then we can, for each of those stakeholders, then analyze, what is the best way to behave? Because the part of the big challenge is that the lower income smallholders tend to be lower income because they lack opportunity, they lack choice, they lack access. And then by really understanding, we're starting increasingly to call it zones of opportunity. What are the opportunities then available to those farmers, depending on which zone they are? And the zone could be characterized by things like infrastructure, distance to markets, availability of extension services, et cetera, et cetera. We can start to see where the biggest opportunity areas are, where the biggest gaps are, and so on. And that visibility is something that is still, unfortunately, in most countries in Africa, quite poor. So it's quite difficult then to target interventions. And with all the data that is potentially available now, we can then make that data available through let's call it data ecosystem, to enable all the various actors who want to help advance smallholder agriculture to do so in a smarter way. I can follow up on this later, but let me pause there for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winter. Now, Dr. Asare, what is your take on?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very excited to be on this program. Data can be used in a variety of ways, especially to support sustainable agriculture and nutrition efforts. First of all, accurate data is needed at the national level, which is sometimes called the macro level data for major decision-making purposes, such as simply knowing how many farmers have access to subsidized fertilizers or purchase inputs, or even average productivity levels. Now, you call this sometimes called the macro level data. It is very, very important for national decision-making processes. Now, without this data processing, data available, every country will have to struggle to actually implement it. Beyond this better data, either at the national level or even regional level, meso level data is also required, even at various variables. But then let me focus more on micro level data requirements, because that is where the action is, according to what I've seen so far. Farmers, as for that matter, smallholder farmers need to know accurate and reliable data on field conditions, on even when to plant their crops, which crops to grow, which varieties to select, which varieties are even drought or even drought tolerant, so they can actually increase their productivity and make much more profit for themselves. But then field-based data relating to soil nutrients like pH, organic matter levels, temperature, soil moisture are largely unavailable at a smallholder level. The question is, how do we ensure that smallholder farmers have access to this better data that are very, very important for them to actually increase their productivity? And it's a conversation that I think most we are not having across several sectors in many countries, especially in Africa where you'll be operating. How do you support these smallholder farmers to have access to this vital data that are needed in planning for them to be able to increase their productivity? And so lack of apps or lack of this data across many countries in Africa has been the bane of low productivity levels in so many crops in Africa. And so for me, I think that this data are very, very important. But the question is, how then do you package the data and make sure that smallholder farmers across every chain of the value chain can actually have this access to data to be able to now inform and plan their production practices, where for me, it's very, very important that you need to address. But it's the only way that I can actually crucially be able to reduce the huge food import bill that many African countries actually do have to go through every year. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I'll follow up on this question. Ask another question. Based on the work that you do at Isoko, you mentioned obviously this data is really needed at the farmers level. They need to know about what's in the soil, what's the nutrient, the soil nutrient for them to be productive activities. But with the work that you're doing at Isoko, how are you able to make affordable and accessible for all, for the critical mass, especially the farmers?
Yeah, thank you again. So essentially, you read this in a variety of ways. We have kind of specialized in making data available to smaller farmers in a form and format that they can actually understand and utilize for their own purposes. I mean, you also, data is very, very fundamental, but ironically, a few people actually want to pay for data. Isoko has been in the business of providing customized information packages relating to commodity prices, weather forecasts, agronomic advisory. But farmers' willingness and ability to pay for this information have been abysmally low. Now, this situation is not different from anywhere else. I mean, if you even those of us on this panel, if you are looking for any information, that you go to any website and then you're asked to pay $10, you are more likely going to shift from that particular website to go to a place where you can actually get it for free. Now, you can't expect anything beyond this from a smaller farm who ordinarily is even struggling to actually keep up with their day-to-day life. And so what we have done is to be able to now find a way to be able to make this data affordable and easily available to the smaller farmers to be able to use. So you do what you call a bundle information package, where this data is bundled with a tangible product that allows these farmers to be able to now access to this data and be able to pay for the data that you are going to use. We have also therefore come to right data for agriculture and nutrition should therefore be considered as a public good and must be provided by public funding, either from national government or by international organizations for free. Farmers will typically not pay information unless it's bundled with other tangible services. So for data to be accessible and affordable to various stakeholders, we need a public-private partnership where public funds are, for instance, used to support private sector actors to collect, manage, and disseminate data to the people that really need it most, especially to the last mile farmer. Many private sector actors, such as my own Isoko, have built a very robust tech platform that allows data to be customized and digital, but this is need to be distributed to the last mile farmer or user. And that's why I think that you need a lot of public-private partners to be able to develop this data in a way that farmers can actually use and support their production activities across board.
Right. Thank you so much, Daniel. And I think I would also like to follow up with Simon. You've mentioned a lot of the work that, some of the work that the foundation is doing in terms of generating data and then using data. But I would like us to dive deeper into give us examples on how the foundation has been able to gather data, but then use the data to impact the lives of the farmers or the stakeholders that you're working with.
Sure. So there's quite a wide array, an increasingly wide array of ways that we're engaging in trying to both access data collected and then make it available for decision support purposes, whether that's, so I'll give you some examples. So one is that we do a lot of work in the seed systems, and in order to have improved seed varieties, approved by local seed regulators, for example, they need information on what's in those varieties, how they perform under different circumstances, and so on. So there's a lot of trialing that's needed before seeds get released. And then once they're released, we want to make sure that those seeds can actually be produced by local seed companies. So there's a lot of information those seed companies will need also in order to understand whether they should actually invest in producing those seeds commercially. So that's so having a data tool that is able to collect all of that information and make it available to all the relevant stakeholders. What we call a seed trials app is at the heart of this ability to then change the equation around the commercialization of publicly bred seed varieties. That's one example. Let me go to the other end of the spectrum just to give you another example. which is the last mile of market access, both for inputs and advice to farmers, and then output market opportunities and financial services and so on that the farmers want to avail themselves of. And we've developed a tool that allows village level or community level entrepreneurs to establish essentially a one-stop shop facility that can then engage with the financiers, with off-takers, with input suppliers, and so on. What we call eFarmers Hub then becomes an application that then generates a lot of data and a lot of transparency on how these businesses are performing, how the farmers are engaging with the businesses, and that gives a lot of confidence then to financial institutions, input suppliers, off-takers, and so on, that they can then use these village-level entrepreneurs as agents for support and engagement with the smallholder farmers. And as we do that at scale, you start to then collect data that can start to go back to what I was talking about before, about really understanding those zones of opportunity, and then sharing that with policymakers, investors, and so on, who might be interested in the, let's say, the kind of meta level questions, or even the macro questions as well. I could go on, but maybe those are just two good examples for now.
Thank you so much, Simon. And for going back to what other stakeholders could do. You've mentioned in your opening remarks, comment, different stakeholders. You mentioned the policymakers and governments, and what could they do, the policymakers, the government, the development organization, and civil society organization? What can they do? How can they leverage data, or how can they boost the data generation for their use and impacting communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll focus on the data part of that. I mean, to go a bit back to Daniel's comments, I mean, I think there's a real need to make data open access, make it easy to navigate, make it easy to understand, of data that exists. But I think we need a range of stakeholders that are generating new data. And, one of the things that we noticed, as an editor of the Global Food Security Journal, is that, we really need to researchers and those who are generating data from low-income settings. If you look at the range of data and research coming out of low-income countries, a lot of it is directed by high-income country researchers and data collectors. Maybe there's some collaboration with African scholars, but there's a real need to support African scholars and ensure that their voices are not muted. We see a lot of domination of data generation from the high income perspective, or high income colleagues going to Africa to diagnose the problems. And the second part of the data generation that's really problematic is the open access of data. There's a lot of data that's behind paywalls. There's a lot of data that's just completely not accessible for those who can't afford to pay for it, which is a real disservice. So as those who are generating data, we need to ensure that African scholars are included and empowered to own their data, collect that data, and publish it globally, and ensure that data is open access. And I really like Simon's example of these village level entrepreneurs, as being data generators themselves. And I think we need to be thinking much more about that kind of data collection, bottom up, community-based data collection, and giving those researchers, those data generators, the voice and agency to be able to publish that data and share it within their communities, within their countries, and even more globally. So the whole paradigm of how we do data and research and publish it needs to totally change. It's really getting to a breaking point where people just can't access this kind of data. So I'd love to hear Daniel and Simon's thoughts on that. But I think this is almost criminal, the way this data is not accessible or generated by those who will need it and use it the most. So those are my thoughts on that.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for the insight. And I think I'll actually balance the question to Daniel to understand. She mentioned she made a lot of points around data accessibility and also affordability for those who actually need it. And I think that's, again, points the point you are making around the farmers, data available for the farmers. Who do we, if with the different interventions, who do we engage? What type of partnership or collaborations will you put in place to ensure that the right data is available to the right first people?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Jessica about the point about that she just said. I mean, there's a lot of data available in Africa. The question is, how do you people get access to this data? I may have a very personal experience when I was studying for my PhD, and then I had come back from Germany to Ghana, Benin, Burkina Faso, looking for certain basic data. And then you go to a national institution, ask them for the data, they say, no, you don't have it. You go to your computer, do a simple Google search, and the data suddenly pops up. What I learned from that was that this data has been collected by a donor-funded project. The project ended, and then the data also vanished with the project as the project ended. And so the very institutions who were supposed to own this data don't even know that data actually exists. Right? But then when you go online, you try to search for it, you can actually find it all of a sudden. So how many people, especially smaller farmers, can do Google search and find data that are even about their own lives? Right? So I think that fundamental issue needs to be addressed. How that data gets published, especially data that have been collected within Africa by Africans or by international organizations that are doing a lot of work, other development projects or any research within Africa. So you need to find a way to bring all the data into a common pool. For me, if you ask me, being a private case, I would say that we need to set up data banks across several countries in Africa. The data banks need to be managed by a private entity and then funded by the state or by the public funding. And so the data can continuously be updated, very, very important, and then be made available to who actually need it. I mean, having the data is one thing. Making the data in a format that people can actually use and understand is also one thing. And so if the data are actually being managed properly by private sector entities who have a bit of commercial motives interest, they will find a way to innovate around how the data can now be made accessible to people who actually need it. But if you're not able to do these things and you continue to rely or even depend on status quo, data will continue to be available, but people who actually need it will not have access to them. And so I think that's very, very important. Making it accessible in a way that actually everybody can understand is very, very important. These days, I mean, the use of mobile phones, I mean, from what you do, we are able to now digitize a whole lot of data and disseminate to as many thousands of farmers within a very short period of time through whether as SMS, IVR, or even possibly through a call center. But then if we don't have these platforms in place, if the time, even though they are there, cannot even be utilized by the people actually need it most. So for me, I think that we need to come together, especially as data operators and data people are collecting data, generating data, to be able to find innovative ways of bringing all the data into a common pool and then developing innovation to allow data to be packaged and customized for smallholder farmer use.
Okay. I think that is an interesting point. The use of technology to disseminate data, because one of the key arguments as well is that if the data is generated, we have all this data is available, it might be available to one group of stakeholders, but then another group of stakeholders will not have that, because most of the farmers who are living in the rural area might not necessarily have access to technology to access that data or even interpret the data. That is really great insight. And I think my last question before we open for the questions from the participants is what would be the practical steps that you will recommend to ensure that the Africa generates its own data and for us to achieve zero hunger? And these practical steps, I would like you to give us some guides for the government, the private sector, research organizations. So I'll start with Jessica.
Yeah, we just recently launched something called the Global Food Systems Dashboard. It's foodsystemsdashboard.org for anyone who wants to go to it, where we've tried to pull together food systems data across every country. And what that data is, it's useful to get a macro picture of a country's food system and looking at undernourishment and diets and nutrition and environmental metrics of food systems. But what it doesn't really give you is the more local picture. And where I think it would be really useful is for countries or even subnational bodies to develop local dashboards, local scorecards for policymakers to be able to quickly look at data across food systems in a visually easy to understand way, so they can get a picture of their data and their situation and their context in their local food systems. So the dashboard is looking very much at the national level, but I think with every country, in Africa, for example, every country is so diverse in its topography and its agriculture systems, its tribes, it's everything, right? So it's thinking about how do you create local dashboards, local scorecards for policymakers to be able to know where to act in their food systems. And Nigeria, for example, is doing that. They found the food systems dashboard useful at a macro level, but they want to Nigerianify it and create their own dashboard subnationally so they can take better decisions depending on the food system within the country, which is so diverse. So I really encourage colleagues who are working on the continent to think about their own local dashboards so they can put print that out and put some data under the nose of a Minister of Agriculture or Minister of Health and show them the state of food systems. So we're really happy to work with anyone who needs guidance on local food system dashboards. So just one idea to throw out there.
Yes, thank you so much, Jessica. Just a quick follow-up on that. For the dashboard, just to give an example to the participants who might be interested in developing that, what else to give us one or two examples of the criteria that you are monitoring on the dashboard?
Falak, are you asking me that question?
Yeah, so I was saying just a quick follow-up to that for the participants that might be looking into the dashboard. What are some of the criteria, or what are the data that you are collecting on the dashboard that are helping in policy making and decision making in the different countries?
Yeah, so on the dashboard, we have about 175 indicators, and it's really data across food supply, food environment, diets, nutrition outcomes, environmental outcomes, and then drivers of food system change. So those that go to the dashboard, if they ask, well, gee, why does Nigeria have a double burden of malnutrition? Why are we still dealing with undernutrition and we have overweight and obesity? And what you could do in the dashboard is start walking backwards from that outcome of double burden and say, okay, well, are fruits and vegetables expensive? Are they produced in the country? Is there a lot of waste and loss of fruits and vegetables? Are ultra-processed foods highly consumed? So you can start creating a case study based on certain outcomes that you see in the dashboard. And the dashboard allows for you to look at cases, tell a story, depending on the outcome. So, but happy to share and for people to reach out to us and we can help in any way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jessica. And then we'll now go to Daniel. What are the practical steps to take to ensure its own data?
Yeah, right. So as I said earlier on, I think that we need to have what I call the African-wide data banks in every country. I mean, data is key, and data is going to be very, very important even in the years ahead. I mean, the question is, how do you make sure the data can continuously be there and updated and disseminated to people who can need it most? So this is why I talk about a data PPP, having data public-private partnership. This is going to be fundamental to realizing the potential of the agriculture sector in Africa. I mean, as you all know, Africa still has some 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, and the future of global food security lies within Africa. But you can only utilize this potential once we're able to manage and learn how to use our data. So I think for me, we need to be able to have, of course, data bank I talk about is still similar to the having the local dashboard that Jessica is talking about. But then for me, how do you really operationalize this in every country? How do you ensure that every country is be able to customize its own local dashboard, be able to use for decision-making purposes? And that's why I think that this PPP arrangement is very, very important. If the private sector and the private sector come together and bring together all the data that are available, now creating this dashboard, data bank now becomes the next logical thing to do. Once that has been done, then you now can actually bring the data onto the screen board of every minister of state, for instance. So a minister of agriculture in the country can just look at the computer screen in his office and have a snapshot view of what is happening in the food security systems in that country. We need to be able to do this, but then having done that, kind of solve the issue at the micro level, where policymakers are now able to have access to the data so they can use to make decisions. But then how about the smallholder farmer itself, or who is down there in the farm, who need the data to be able to use? And this is where having platforms in place to be able to customize the data in a way that can be disseminated to large number of farmers or people at the bottom of the value chain is very, very important to me. And so I think for me, I will talk about data PPP, strengthen the value chain system in agriculture and making sure data can even be collected from the farmers themselves. You can still have what you call even crowdsource basic data from the farmers that they can now submit the data through a mobile platform. That data can now all be aggregated into a dashboard system, which can then be used for decision-making purposes. So these are quite things that you need to do to be able to get out there.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Daniel. Last but not least, Simon.
Well, I want to build on Daniel's point because we're in the process of developing our own digital and data sort of ecosystem vision. And it's very aligned actually with what you're saying, Daniel, from our perspective. But let me add a few refinements to it, and certainly, very eager to discuss with other organizations that are interested in these same concepts that Daniel and Jessica are talking about. So from our side, one of the big challenges is, as I think you alluded to also earlier, Daniel, what's the incentive for people to capture the data, and who pays for that? So that's why the PPP piece is so important, but that doesn't mean that everybody then gets equal access to the data for free. Because we're affiliated with Syngenta, on the business side, we have many discussions with the business to say, well, what are you prepared to pay for, and what are you, willing to invest in, and so on. And if they get data, for example, that's useful to their sales force, that enables them to understand where, for example, they could actually sell products in the future that they're not selling them now because the right crops are being grown, the farmers are having farms at the a slightly larger size, and more commercial, and so on, and they didn't realize that. They're going to be willing to pay for that kind of data. So it's for the private sector, it's important that we align those incentives and then get them to invest in and pay for data that's useful for their commercial purposes. But at the same time, when we're talking about things like extension or NGOs that are working in lower income communities where farmers are still very poor and not able to access the more commercial retail outlets, for example, on the input side, or offtake markets on the output market side, and so on, then that data should be freely available. And then the question is, how does that, what Daniel was talking about, how does that data flow in and out of the farmers' hands? And sometimes you're going to have farmers who have smartphones, or somebody in their family has a smartphone, or somebody in their community has a smartphone, and they're able to engage with apps and so on. But in much of Africa right now, that's still not the case. And that's why these agri-entrepreneurs or farmers hubs types of models that I was alluding to before, where you have one person or maybe a couple of people in a community who have a bit better education, are a bit more entrepreneurial and so on, and are willing to step in, can then become change agents for those communities. And then not every single farmer needs to be directly accessing an app on a mobile phone or on a smartphone. and just understanding exactly how to then incentivize those agents to capture data is also very important. We've had a lot of aspirational hopes that those agents can collect a lot of data, but actually, unless you pay them for the data and check that verify that that data is good quality and is real, you either don't get the data or you get garbage. And so it's really important to understand in quite some detail the specific connections through this system. And then you can build this, we believe, this public and private partnership that Daniel's talking about, and figure out what are those data sets that need to be publicly available, to respond to Jessica's point that there is still, unfortunately, a lot of data behind firewalls that really shouldn't be. And then what are the bits of data for data privacy purposes or for commercial use purposes and so on that actually it's reasonable to say shouldn't be publicly available.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Simon. Now I'll go to some of the questions from the participants. And the first question is for Jessica. As regards to getting data for a smallholder class of farmers, we are looking at tracking their data in terms of crop cultivators, number of farmers involved in specific type of crop. And I think this is mostly about the dashboard. And if we're going to leave some link, but do you want to take that, Jessica?
Yeah, so I think on the dashboard, we're actually going to be having some data from Mario Herrero's group. They do a lot of spatial analysis using remote sensing, GIS, to look at farm sizes all over the world and what's being grown on those farms, the diversification or the diversity of those farming systems. And they go further and look at the nutritional yield of what's on farms. And they basically show that smallholders have more diverse farms and they're more nutrient rich. And so smallholders are very important, injecting a lot of the nutrients in the food supply because their farms are so diverse. So we'll have that data from Mario Herrero's group in January on the dashboard, which will be a really nice contribution across the world. So, but I'm sure, you know, Simon and Daniel can probably answer to this as well, of the importance of the smallholder farmer data and their access to it to be able to make better decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And the next question is for Daniel. The question goes, how do one capture data in rural area where the farming activities are smallholder in nature? I think you've mentioned, you've responded to some questions, but you want to provide a bit more insight?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I got the question right, but are you asking about how you collecting data from the smallholder farmers?
Yes, so he said, how do one capture data in rural area where the farming activities are smallholder in nature? How do you get data from the smallholder farmers?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, this is essentially what I was talking about, which is having a system in place where you are able to, first of all, collect the data and maintain it. But collecting the data is just one of activity, but then if you don't have a system in place to continuously update that data, within 2 or 3 that data becomes more or less outdated. And so what you do at Isoko is that if you take, say, our commodity price data that we have been collecting for the past 10 years, we have agents all over the country who go to the market centers every day, every week, with mobile devices, asking about price of agricultural content, putting that data onto our platform. Once the data comes to our platform, you now do a lot of quality assessment and check whether the data is accurate and is viable, and then you begin to now disseminate that same data to the same farmers who the data came from. And so these structures need to be in place for you to be able to get data from the smallholder farmer at the farm level. You can't really sit in national capital and expect to have very micro-scale data from a farm. And of course, you can use remote sensing data to be able to collect data, but that data you cannot attribute to any farmer. You only have a general view of what is happening. For you to be able to attribute any data to a particular farm activity, that data, somebody needs to go out there to be able to now ground through that data to what is happening on the ground. And that is where I say that private sector actors are very, very key. The states are going to be very, very poor having these systems in place. I mean, where are you operating in Ghana and elsewhere in Africa? I mean, the national government institutions are always very, very slow, even providing their own data for national level purposes. But then whenever a private sector actor is involved, within 2 or 3 months, data has been collected, they can have a system in place to continuously update that data. And so you need to have what we call the agent network system in place across many countries, where these guys are motivated, they are resourced, and that data is coming in real time. I mean, without any resource, without any motivation to these guys, they'll give you garbage. Right, and so having a system in place where people are bringing data, are motivated, are incentivized is very, very important in ensuring accurate data coming from the field.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel. I think the other question again was, I think we have quite a big question around the dashboard. What we're going to do is that we're going to, later on, once Jessica has mentioned that it's going to be publicized later on, early next year. So once that is done, what we can do is provide support in disseminating that so that you can all have access to the dashboard, especially I have a few questions asking about examples of the dashboard and also can the private sector lead the initiative to figure out the data infrastructure availability and access. And I think the last question we have here in terms of the private sector. So how do we ensure that the data collected not only available for the private sector, but then also the accurate data is used by the public sector? Because I think that goes back to the question, the comments that Daniel made around quality data, because you can generate the data and the quality might not be up to par. So how do we ensure that the government or the policymakers have accurate data for their decision making? And I think I'll throw this to both Jessica and Daniel.
Jessica, you want to go first?
It'd be good to hear both Daniel and Simon's perspective on this. On the dashboard, we don't have a lot of private sector data because a lot of private sector data is proprietary. When is it in the best interest for private sector to release data? And so we're very keen to get more data from private sector because they hold a lot of data, not only on farmers, but consumer behavior. We have nothing really on consumer behavior on the dashboard, but we're very keen to have that. And those that hold that data the most are private sector, but it's often just not released because of competition issues. So we're really keen to get private sector data if it's representing various countries. There's a lot of data in the United States, for example, that comes from private sector. But again, we want to create equity in the dashboard, ensure we have data for every country, low, middle, high income countries. So we struggle actually to get private sector data because it's either not available or it's behind a paywall. We have some data from Euromonitor, which tracks retail data. It's incredibly expensive. It's just insanely expensive. So we really struggle with private sector data and getting access to it. I'd love to hear Daniel and Simon's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you are right. I mean, getting data from private sector is quite difficult. That's because data collection is very, very expensive. So right now you're collecting data from the northern region of Ghana, also in Liberia, where you're collecting data from about 1 million people. These are very rich socioeconomic data from more than 1 million people. Now it's going to cost like $2 million to do so. And so once you do this, and if you're a private company who develop this database actually from your own resources, then you've got to have a way to be able to kind of find a way to actually cover your costs. And that's what is lacking in many instances where private sector now becomes a bit more reluctant and sharing data that they have actually spent their own money to collect. But like in Ghana, you actually did a PPP with the government of Ghana where we partnered them to collect data from 50,000 smallholder farmers in the country. The agreement of that data is now co-owned by both ISOCO and the government of Ghana, in this case, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And so the government is now free to use the data in any form that they want. And at the same time, we are also free to use the data, commercial data for whatever that we want. And so this is very, very crucial. If we don't have this structure in place where the private sector is supported to at least cover the cost of data generation alone, then they will find it very, very difficult to share the data that they are collecting. And then for me also, having the data is one thing. Getting the data out there in the hands of who need it is also one fundamental thing. And the cost of distributing data to smallholder farmers, for instance, is quite very, very high. And so until these issues are addressed, then this issue about how do you pay for data, how do you get data from private sector, is going to linger on for some time now. I mean, however, there's certain type of data that we have that you can freely give to the dashboard that you actually have. You have commodity price data, about 50 commodities in Ghana for the past 10 years. These are market price data that's showing the price of agricultural commodities over the last 10 years. The data is system on that database you are able to share with people who need it all the time, particularly for research, for educational purpose, or even for smallholder farmer use. But then if anybody comes and then the purpose of the data acquisition is not so clear to us, that's where you see a bit of reluctance on our part in giving that data to them. But once the clear objective, the clear purpose, then the data can easily be shared with people. And so I think that these partnerships are very, very important. Partnership with the private sector actors to be able to share data is very important. Let me talk about weather for data, for instance. We are getting our weather forecast data from AWare, who's a US-based company. Now, AWare has been struggling to actually make the data available for free for smallholder farmers across Africa. But then how do you do that? How do the cost of getting that data out there is still very, very expensive? Somebody needs to cover that cost. And so because of that, they are unable to do so until now. So what they are able to do is to be able to do this small scale data dissemination through other programs that we have. So we really need to look at this whole issue in a much more holistic point of view. Look at how do public sector funding support private companies to be able to generate, maintain, and get the data out to people who actually need it most.
Maybe I can just build on that point. What I'm seeing at the moment is, I would say, a bit of a race for the ecosystem. So there's a lot of private sector startups and even larger companies like MasterCard and others who are gathering a lot of data and want to become, let's say, the ecosystem platform. With the hope that they can monetize that data and build a business out of it. When you actually scratch away a little bit and see what most of the businesses that are trying to do this are doing, is it's one small part of the ecosystem. They're a financial service provider, they're an agri-input supplier, or various other types of products and services or market opportunities that they're offering, and then they're trying to build the whole ecosystem around that. And it's really not working. It's actually going against, the very spirit of trying to create the ecosystem that we're trying to create, because you're getting these perverse incentives that people don't want to then release the data and so on. So I think what we need is, and it builds on what both Jessica and Daniel are saying, but we need governments to really step in and set a regulatory environment that says these are the kinds of data that need to be in the public domain. We reinforce that with a policy framework, maybe with some incentive payments in order to encourage the investment to be made in some of those public data sets. And then we have the private sector doing the bits of what's needed in the ecosystem for themselves. So there's some sort of shakeout that's needed. Now, it's going to be very interesting to watch what's happening in Kenya, because they just released a new policy framework on digital and data I think a month or two ago now. And so they're stepping into more of a leadership position here from the public sector side. And I just happen to know that. I imagine there are some other African countries that are doing the same right now. But I think it's going to need a lot of facilitation. If it's just the public sector does it on its own and doesn't then set up this kind of PPP mechanisms or multi-stakeholder mechanisms that Daniel's talking about, I fear we're going to then have the public sector trying to do one thing and the private sector is going to carry on doing its own thing, and we're not going to create this kind of let's say stronger ecosystem that we all aspire to. So I think this needs a lot more conversation, a lot more interaction. We want to, as one small stakeholder in this whole thing, we're trying to lean in on this ourselves, and certainly, as I said before, look forward to engaging with others.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the amazing insights that were shared. We're coming to the end of our session. And I think those are the major takeaways are that to transform the African agricultural sector is really imperative for us to be strategic in the decision making and interventions to have maximum impact. Quite a few insights were shared. Some of them were around really encouraging local stakeholders and governments developing their own data banks, the dashboards, to have the national and local perspectives. We have to ensure that Africans are included in the data collection process to ensure accuracy, having this public-private partnership to ensure that accurate not collected but is accessible and affordable to all. And also finally having the government to regulate the environment to make sure that to have some information that have to be in the public domain or those that can be paid for. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Fanzo, Dr. Winters, and Dr. Asare-Trai. Really appreciate your time. And we'll head back now to the main stage for the next item on the agenda. Thank you.